Assalamu alaikum students, how are you all? Hope that you are having an amazing day. I'm Muhammad Naeem Amin Bhatti and today we are going to discuss our first lecture regarding the poets of the Romantic Age. I have divided this lecture into two parts and basically this study session consists of two lectures. So the very first lecture on our study session will cover the following topics like the features and characteristics of romantic poetry, its major subject matters, and the three schools of thought or three groups of romantic poetry, among which we will discuss in this lecture the only first, the lake poets, in which we will discuss William Wordsworth, S.T. Coleridge, and Southey, and the other two groups like the Scott group and the younger group will be discussed in the next lecture. So first of all, we start our lecture with the characteristics of romantic poetry. Here are the major features of the romantic poetry. Basically, the romantic poetry explores a love of the unspoiled natural world, the world which concern positively with all the surroundings around the poet. It discusses the sublime and the beautiful ideas which are in the mind of the poet, the nature of existence, like we can see that William Wordsworth, he is the poet of nature. He had defined nature in various ways, like the nature as a guardian, nature as a nurse, and nature as a teacher or preacher. So all the poets of romantic school of thoughts deals with the existence of the nature, and similarly the value of the individual is a basic subject matter of the romantic poetry, and side by side they also cover the various aspects of the human imagination, memory, and the importance of emotions. These three poetic devices, we can see especially the imagination and importance of emotion are deliberately discovered and discussed in the romantic poetry. If we talk about the major subjects of romantic poetry, they will be the optimistic sense of renewal, that the major subject of romantic poetry, they have the thoughts revealed around them, and especially the thoughts which exaggerate the human existence and the renewalness or novelty of the character of human being. That is a major subject. And the other one is that is interesting in the language and life. It pretty much discusses the life of the common people, what the life offers to them and what they expect from their lives, and they discuss the special effects of the life on common people, and especially the creativity of the individuals, the mystery from past and future also, and especially the synthesis mean to prepare some type like the emotional thoughts, the emotional feelings, the preparation for the discovery of nature, and the universality of their thoughts. All above given four points like the creativity, mystery, synthesis, and universality deals with the romantic subjects of poetry. Like I would rather say that yesterday is a history, tomorrow is a mystery, today is a gift, that's why it is called present. So romantic poetry is all about the present scenarios of this world. So let's have a time frame of the romantic poetry. We take a quick look on it. The first work of the romantic poetry was lyrical ballad by Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth, that was published in 1798. It was basically a collaborated work with these two writers, these two poets like Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Wordsworth. Traditionally, the time frame of romantic poetry is considered to be ended with the death of Salvator Scott, who was the head of Scott group, that is the second school of thought in romantic poetry, and it was ended in 1832. So there is a concept of three schools of thoughts here on your screens. You can see it. The Lake Poets is the very first one. The leader of the Lake Poets was William Wordsworth from 1770 to 1850. He was also a poet laureate of the British poetry, as you can say, the UK or United Kingdom or Great Britain. After that, St. Coleridge, 1772-1834, a close companion to William Wordsworth and also a collaborated writer and poet with him, William Wordsworth. And the third one was Robert Southey. The second is the Scott group, and the third is the younger group. We will discuss it in our next lecture of this study session. So the Scott group is consist upon Sir Walter Scott from 1771 to 1832, who was the head of the Scott group, Thomas Campbell from 1774 to 1844, and Thomas More from 1779 to 1852. If we talk about the younger group, that was consisting upon the three young poets. The reason to call them the younger group was that all of these three poets were died in the early age, in early young ages, like Lord George Gordon Byron from 1788 to 1824. He was died at the age of 36 years. P.B. Shelley, he was died at the age of approximately 30 years, from 1792 to 1822. And the poet of beauty and poet of truth, John Keats, who was died at the age of 25 or 26 odd years. He was belonging from 1795 to 1821. So now we take a look on the lake poets, which is the primary subject of today's lecture here, and the other two groups will be discussed in the second lecture. The lake poets was first generation poets, and their lives were spent partly in the lake district. That's why they were called the lake poets. Among them, St. Coleridge and William Wordsworth are prominent. They linked together by a bond of friendship, and that's why they were having a revolutionary ideas for youth about the changing scenarios of the youth, about the exaggeration of their thoughts, about the youthfulness, and also about the natural world. William Wordsworth and St. Coleridge together published a collaborated work, that was the Lyrical Ballad, in 1798. If we talk about William Wordsworth, he was born on April 7, 1770 in Cockermouth, Cumberland, England, and Wordsworth's mother died when he was at the age 7, and his father was died when he was at the age of 13, so he was orphan at the age of 13. That was to something that inherited, that was he was inherited with lots of knowledge from his father as well about the nature, and he wrote his first poetry when he was in Havickshead Grammar School at the age of 13. But despite of these losses, despite of this cruelty of life, he never indulged any type of sorrowness or any type of gloominess in his poetry. Rather, he talks about the positive constructive ideas, and especially in his poetry like Daffodils, he talks about the willingness of happiness of the mind of reader and the poets as well. So he wrote his first poetry at Havickshead Grammar School when he was at the age of 13. He went on the study at Cambridge University, that was the famous university at that time, and he did not excel there, but he managed to graduate in 1791 at the age of approximately 21 years. After that, he met with the Coleridge, and to whom he dedicated most of his poems also, and both of them has written the preface to the Lyrical Ballad, considered as the central work of the Romantic literary traditions and theory. He sets forth what he sees as the elements of the world, like the natural world, a new type of poetry. That was a totally revolutionized poetry by William Wordsworth, because he has changed the concept of poetry by giving the definition of poetry. According to him, the poetry is the outburst or outlet of powerful feelings of or emotions. We will talk about his poetic definition in next slides. So that was based on the real language, the language which was not exaggerated to such extent like the other poets did in the previous sections, but we can say that the romantic poetic tradition was totally basing upon the day-to-day language like the real language. It avoids the poetic diction of much of the 18th century poetry. Same was the case with the William Wordsworth. He avoided these poetic dictions from the 18th century poetry. Wordsworth's distinctions are he gives his famous definition of poetry like this: poetry is basically the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings from emotions recollected in the tranquility. That is the basic and fundamental type of the definition of poetry which ever poet has given in the history of English literature. In 1843, Queen Victoria I was crowned, and she was very inspired by the poetry of William Wordsworth. So that's why William Wordsworth was given the position of poet laureate in 1843. So that's why he was the poet laureate of Great Britain for approximately 7 years until his death. Held this position until his death in 1850. So after his death, his position was ultimately considered as resignated. But during his position of poet laureate, he was pretty much concerned to be as the right hand of Queen Victoria, and he was the major participant of all the government and the public sector events in the United Kingdom. Now we talk about the major works of William Wordsworth. Wordsworth wrote a large number and variety of lyrics, especially his Lucy poems deals with the nature. He says that Lucy doesn't die, but she had gone for a proper rest or permanent rest in the lap of nature. He says that the human being doesn't die, but they only gave themselves towards nature, they venture towards the nature, and they sleep in the lap of nature. The Cuckoo was the famous poem. Solitary Reaper is a story about the women who is reaping and singing at the same time, and the Daffodils, the very famous poem that we have read about in the Matriculations, and that was one of his major and most famous poems of ever time. Besides the lyrics, Wordsworth wrote a number of sonnets of the rare merit to Milton, Westminster Bridge, The World is Too Much with Us, and a fine combination of the dignity of the thought and language can be seen in these above given poems. In his odes, as Ode to the Duty and Ode on the Intimations of Immortality, he describes the fundamental thoughts about the nature, and also he gives us the poetic dictions from his poetry. He gives the expression of his life, high ideals, and the philosophy of life. And according to William Wordsworth, the philosophy of life is only nature. That his definition of nature rounds about the nature is all around us, and nature is nature as a teacher and preacher, nature as a guardian of human life, nature as a nurse for human beings also. So Wordsworth as a poet of nature, the poet of man, the poet of human life, that is called Wordsworth, and he is also called the poet of nature. Deliberately or especially, his concern was about the natural happenings. In his youth, he came under the influence of the French Revolution that was started in France. According to Wordsworth, man is a part of nature, man will be part of nature, and man was the part of nature. In poem Resolution and Independence, he makes a single picture of the natural depictions at that time. Wordsworth's greatest nature poems are lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey, yew trees, and the Simpton Pass. You can say that the daffodils and especially to Cuckoo and Lucy poems are also dedicated to the natural subjects. His longer poems include much that is the prosy and uninteresting, but still they gain the attention of the reader. He used to write he started to writing the long narrative poem, and he wants to exaggerate these poems through the poetic dictions. He used the title The Recluse for the three major poems. The very first one, the first part of Recluse was the book The Prelude, and the second was the Excursion, and the third was never completed in his lifetime. So he was writing under the major article of Recluse, and which treats the subjects of nature, man, and society. The prelude, treating of the growth of poet's mind, was to introduce this work, and the Excursion was written in 1814, is the second book of the Recluse, and the third book was never completed in his lifetime. Even after his death, that was not completed, even until or unless he was died. Now we take a look upon his important quotes from his works, that the best portion of a good man's life is his little nameless unremembered acts of kindness and love. Here he preaches us about the love, about the kindness, about the nature of human life, that a man should does a little virtue in this way, that nobody should know about that virtue, only that man who is doing it does. So fill your paper with the breathing of your heart, that listen to your heart what it wants. Wisdom is often time nearer when we stoop, and though nothing can bring back the hour. I wandered lonely as a cloud. I wandered lonely as a cloud is a famous initiative or initial line from the daffodils that we have studied in the matriculation courseworks. So that was a truly called a poem of nature. Nature was the source of all joy for Wordsworth. Nature for him was a living personality, just like a teacher, a guardian, and a nurse also. Now we talk about Samuel Taylor Coleridge from 1772 to 1834. Samuel Taylor Coleridge was born on 21st October 1772. The youngest of 14 children, he was educated after his father's death, and he was also an orphan like William Wordsworth was, and he attended the Christ Hospital and Jesus College for his further education, and at that time he was writing his poems but was not pretty much famous at that time. But when in 1794 he was met with William Wordsworth, and the age of transition was end for him, he started writing in very effective way. He often wrote the poetry. His talent did not manifest until after 1794, when he transitioned into what would later be described as the Romantic poetry. The critics called him that because he was an opium eater, he was addicted to opium, and he used it to soothing himself for the satisfaction of his mind and body. He was an addicted to the opium. That's why the critics call him, he was half poet and half madman. So half madman means that he was not fully a point of genius person, but some critics are agree at that point that madness is itself a type of geniusness. I will name here the William Shakespeare, that he called in Hamlet when Hamlet was mad. So his characters speak that madness is itself a type of geniusness. But if we call him mad, he was also knowing the philosophy of life, all about the geniusness. So poetry of Coleridge deals with most of the poems in the lyrical ballads were written by Wordsworth at that time, but Coleridge contributed for four poems. The most famous one was The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is a story of a mariner who came back from the sea voyage and met with a person and says him about the curse of the Lord on him. You have listened these famous lines, water water everywhere, and all the boats did shrink, water water everywhere, and nor any drop to drink. These are from the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Coleridge as a supernatural poet is like, if we can call the Wordsworth as the natural poet, the poet of nature, then we can call Coleridge as the poet of supernatural thoughts. He described the natural phenomena in an exaggerated form, in a hi-fi way. In lyrical ballads, Wordsworth and Coleridge presented a liberating aesthetic player. Aesthetic player means some kind that we say in Urdu like hisse jamaliyat, means zoke jamaliyat, the something that is the nearly to the likeness and dislikeness of the people. And the poetry should express in genuine language, in a pure language, through experiences, and the narrative should be built up with using the emotions and the imagination. So the supernatural poet Coleridge was writing his poetry in an emotional way, imaginative way, by using his experiences through the genuine language, and he was given the garnish of his poetry through the supernatural thoughts. That is, the truest experience is to be found in nature, and that was a balance between the poet's influence and the real language, and also a balance between the commonplace and the supernatural thoughts. If we see the stream of his work, the very first work here we can see from the first point, that was the poetic expressions to his political aspiration in the religious way. He was pretty much concerned with the religion also, but was not according to the common writers at that time. He was specialized in his religious beliefs, that he's written like his religious political book, that Destiny of Nations and Ode to the Departing Year, that was from 1796, before the very first publishing of the preface to the lyrical ballad, that was published in 1798. But like Wordsworth, he also began to think differently after the excess of the French Revolution, that has a greater effect on our poet as Coleridge. This change the thoughts is shown in his beautiful poem France, and an ode 1798 that was written, which he himself called the recantation of his poetry. After that, he, like Wordsworth, supported the conservative cause of his poetry, because he and Wordsworth both were writing at the same time the same book in a collaborated way. If we talk about the Ancient Mariner and the Christabel, both were his famous poems. Coleridge was a man of the gigantic genius. Like if we call him genius, that a madness is itself is a form of geniusness, as I have mentioned earlier. But his lack of willpower and the addiction to the opium prevented him from the realm of poetry, the true sense of poetry, that is. So he wrote his two great poems, The Ancient Mariner and The Christabel. In these two poems, Coleridge saved the supernaturalism, the sensationalism, and psychological truth. All these three subject matters were dealt in The Ancient Mariner and Christabel, side by side with his all the poetic works. And if we talk about the sensationalism, in which our poet Coleridge has uses the five senses to describe the different things, and the psychological truth that deals with the psychoanalytical feelings of any person at that time and his characters. If we talk about his art of characterization, that was pretty much concerned with the perception of the mysteries that surrounds the commonplace things of everyday life. So his character building was like having the perception, the psychological truths, the sensations, the supernaturalism, and above all the imagination, that is a purely quality of a romantic poetry. So his other famous works are Kubla Khan, in which he describes to us the dreamlike panorama of his poetry. That was a poem which was written is in half sleepiness or in a dream. Kubla Khan is a poem all about that, in which the poet describes to us that Kubla Khan has built a very big palace at an unimaginable land. There he has planted many gardens, and there are the canals of various types, and an Abbasid maid or Abbasid women is used to sing different type of songs on the melodies of the instruments of music. So the writer himself thinks that I will also build such a famous type of palace in my imaginations, through my imaginations. So that was a poem which was written when he was under the addiction of opium, or he was sleeping. That after that he write down the love. That was his famous poem, The Dark Lady, one of his most important poems, and Youth and Age, and Dejection and Ode. His number of poems are full of very minute descriptions of the natural sceneries, yet his strength lay in his the marvelous dream faculty, and his reputation as a poet rests to the ancient mariner Christabel and Kubla Khan, where he touched the heights of romantic traditions. Here is the word dream faculty used for his addictiveness to the opium, that when he used the opium he was in a half dream like situation, so that's why he used to write these poems in his dreams. Now we talk about Robert Southey from 1774 to 1843. He was the third poet of the group of lake poets. Unlike Wordsworth and Coleridge, he lacked the higher qualities of poetry. His achievement as a poet is not much, but he was the poet laureate before William Wordsworth has taken his position after his death of Southey. So that's why he was famous at that time. Means to say that his poets were not pretty much important or famous at that time, but his position was famous at that time. His achievement as a poet are not so much, and he wrote down the Thalba and the curse of Kahma, and Modek and Roderick are based on the mythology of different nations. If we talk about his some distinctions that he has achieved at his lifetime, he also wrote a number of ballads and short poems, of which the best known is about the love for the books. My days among the dead are past. But he wrote far better prose than the poetry. His admirable work was Life of Nelson, remains a classic work still in these days. Also he was made the poet laureate in 1813, and he had this title up to 1843 until his death. Approximately 30 years he enjoyed the position of poet laureate at that time, and after his death in 1843 Wordsworth was succeeded as the poet laureate. So there are some references through which you can deal with the further studies. If there are some queries or questions or confusion in your mind, you can ask to me in comments box below. And similarly, hopefully I'm glad that you have attended this lecture, and hopefully you have understood all the thoughts and all the points which I have delivered to you in this lecture. But still, if the need arises for further assistance, you can ask to me in comments box any question or any confusion which is coming to your mind. I will be happy to answer to you about those questions. So that's it from today's lecture. We will discuss the second lecture about the romantic poetry soon, hopefully inshallah, and you should stay home, stay safe. That's it from me. It's goodbye from me.